Good evening, my little creatures of the night. Mr. Wendigo back again with your late night creature feature. Before we begin, I'm curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Alone in your room? Driving through empty roads? Drop a comment and let me know. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now then, let's see what tonight's tale brings us. Antarctica doesn't care about your doctorate. Doesn't matter if you spent 8 years studying cryobiology or can name every ice shelf from memory. The continent will kill you the same way it kills everyone else who forgets what they're standing on. Cold doesn't negotiate. Wind doesn't care about your credentials. The ice just waits for you to make one mistake, and then it takes you. Dr. Elias Cade understood this better than most people, or at least he used to, back when he was still fully human. He'd been at Glacier Station for 18 months now, running back-to-back winter rotations without a break. Most people couldn't handle 6 months down here before the isolation started eating at them. The darkness got to them first, that absolute darkness that lasted for months, where the sun was just a memory and a promise. Then the wind, which never stopped screaming across the ice like something alive and furious. Then the cold itself, which pressed in through every seal and gap, looking for ways to kill you in your sleep. Elias said he preferred it that way, said the isolation helped him focus, said the darkness made him more productive. Commander Rhea Volkov thought that was complete horseshit, and she told him so more than once. She'd seen obsession before, watched it grow in people the way frost creeps across glass in the deep cold. It started slow, almost invisible, just a person spending a little more time alone than usual. Then it spread, inexorable and patient, until one day you realized they'd crossed a line they couldn't come back from. By the time you noticed the problem, it was already too late to do anything about it. Rhea had commanded an icebreaker in the Ross Sea before this assignment, 15 years on the water, breaking channels through pack ice that could crush a ship like an aluminum can. She'd seen things out there that didn't make it into the official reports. Pack ice that moved against the current like something was pushing it from below. Thermal blooms in water that should have been frozen solid, rising from depths where nothing warm should exist. And that one time the incident that got her transferred to this frozen research station in the middle of absolutely nowhere when the ocean froze upward in a column 50 feet high, rising into the air like some kind of impossible fountain made of ice, reaching for the ship with what looked almost like intention. The Navy called it a freak phenomenon, thermal inversion, they said, supercooled water meeting warm air, creating explosive crystallization. A 1 in a million chance that just happened to occur right next to her ship. Rhea called it a load of shit, but she kept that opinion to herself these days. Nobody wanted to hear that the ocean could hunt you. Nobody wanted to believe that ice could think. So now she ran security at Glacier Station, keeping 12 scientists and support staff alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. And she tried not to think about columns of ice reaching for her ship like frozen fingers. "Coffee's out again," Mara Ionescu said, dropping into the chair across from Rhea with the kind of exhausted sigh that said she'd been up for way too many hours. Rhea looked up from her tablet, where she'd been reviewing the same supply manifest for the 3rd time without actually reading it. Since when? Since Elias took the last of it down to the lab about 4 hours ago. Mara shrugged, pulling her dark hair back into a ponytail. 3rd time this week he's cleaned out the coffee supply. I'm starting to think he's hoarding it down there. He's still in Lab 3? Where else would he be? The man practically lives down there now. Mara Ionescu was the systems engineer, which meant she was the person responsible for keeping the station from freezing them all to death while they slept. She was 26 years old, originally from Romania, but raised in Chicago, and this was her 2nd rotation in Antarctica. She'd signed up for the job because the pay was double what she'd make anywhere else, and she had student loans from MIT that wouldn't pay themselves. Her plan was simple: 2 years in Antarctica, pay off the debt, then get a normal job somewhere warm, where the sun actually rose every day. She was practical, smart, and refreshingly normal in a place where normal was in increasingly short supply, which made her something of an anomaly at Glacier Station these days. "Someone needs to check on him," Rhea said, even though she knew what the response would be. "You volunteering for that?" Mara raised an eyebrow. "Hell no." Rhea stood up, grabbed her thick fleece jacket from the back of her chair. "But I'll send Nolan down there. Maybe another scientist can talk some sense into him." Dr. Nolan Pierce was in the communications room, staring at seismic readouts on 3 different monitors like they were personally offending him. He'd been doing that a lot lately, ever since the drilling team punched through to the cave 4 weeks ago. The readouts painted lines and curves that should have meant something, geological data that was supposed to tell you what was happening kilometers beneath your feet, but lately none of it made sense. "Cade's been in the lab for 12 hours straight," Rhea said without preamble. Nolan didn't look up from the screens. 14, actually. I've been keeping track." "You're keeping track of how long Elias has been locked in a room with that sample?" "Someone should be." He tapped one of the screens, highlighting a section of the seismic data. "These readings don't make any sense, Rhea." "Do they ever make sense down here?" "No, but they used to be consistently wrong, which meant we could work with them. Now they're inconsistently wrong, and that's so much worse." He finally looked at her, and Rhea could see the stress in his eyes, the way his jaw was tight. The patterns keep changing, like something down there is moving or learning. Rhea had known Nolan Pierce for 3 years now. He was a geophysicist who'd predicted something moving under the Antarctic ice long before anyone took him seriously. He'd published papers about it, presented at conferences, showed his data to anyone who would listen. Most people in the field had laughed at him, dismissed him as another crackpot with a pet theory. Then the drill team at Glacier Station found the cave that shouldn't exist, and suddenly nobody was laughing anymore. Nolan had been vindicated, but he didn't look happy about being right. "Go make sure Elias hasn't frozen himself to the floor," Rhea said. "Drag him up here for dinner if you have to. And if he is frozen to the floor, then thaw him out first, then drag him to dinner." Nolan stood up, stretched, worked some of the stiffness out of his shoulders. "You know what day it is. Does it even matter down here? Probably not. But it's been exactly 9 days since we pulled that first sample out of the cave. 9 days, and it's already tripled in size. So nothing we know about grows that fast, Rhea. Nothing biological, nothing geological, nothing that should exist on this planet." He grabbed his jacket, started pulling it on. "Whatever that thing is, it's not following any rules we understand." He left before Rhea could respond to that, which was probably for the best because she didn't have a good response anyway. Mara leaned back in her chair, watching Rhea with those dark, analytical eyes. "You really think Elias is okay?" Rhea pulled up the security feed on her tablet. Lab 3 appeared on the screen, a white-walled room with equipment lining the walls and one figure hunched over a microscope in the center, completely motionless. Elias Cade had been sitting in exactly that position for the past 14 hours, barely moving, barely even seeming to breathe. "No," Rhea said quietly, watching the unmoving figure on the screen. "I really don't think he's okay at all." Dinner at Glacier Station was an exercise in making freeze-dried lasagna seem like actual food, which was harder than it sounded after 6 months of eating nothing but reconstituted meals and whatever passed for vegetables after that long in storage. The common room smelled like tomato sauce that had never seen a real tomato and coffee that could strip paint. 12 people crammed around 2 folding tables that had seen better decades. The drilling crew sat on one side, still in their work clothes and smelling like machine oil and ice. The science staff occupied the other table, looking tired and distracted. Support personnel squeezed in wherever they could find space, which wasn't much. Miller was in the middle of telling a story about his ex-wife, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. So she says to me, "Mike, if you really loved me, you wouldn't spend 8 months at a time on a frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world." And I said, "Honey, I do love you. And that's exactly why I need the hazard pay from this job so I can afford the kind of life you want us to have." He shook his head, grinning. Turns out that wasn't the right answer. A few people laughed. Chen smiled into his food, not looking up. Rodriguez snorted. Rhea sat at the end of one table with her tray of questionable lasagna, half listening to the conversation. These mandatory dinners were part of the station protocol team cohesion, they called it. Building morale, keeping people connected to each other so they didn't lose their minds when the sun didn't rise for 4 months straight and the thermometer read numbers that seemed incompatible with human survival. Mara dropped into the seat next to her, her own tray loaded with the same institutional food. Elias skipped dinner again? Looks like it. That's 5 dinners in a row now, right? 6, actually. Should we be worried about that? Rhea looked across the room at the empty seat at the science table, the one that should have held Elias Cade but had been vacant for almost a week now. Nolan Pierce sat there instead, pushing freeze-dried vegetables around his plate without eating them, staring at nothing in particular. "Probably," Rhea admitted, "but I'm not sure what we can do about it." Miller's story was winding down, something about divorce papers being served in a betting pool among his Navy buddies about how long the marriage would last. The room filled with scattered laughter, the kind that sounded a little too loud, a little too forced, people trying too hard to seem normal. Then the lights flickered. The laughter cut off like someone had thrown a switch. Everyone went quiet, looking up at the fluorescent tubes overhead. The lights flickered again, dimmed for half a second, then came back to full brightness. "Mara?" someone called out from the drilling crew table. "On it." Mara was already standing up, moving toward the door. "It's probably just the generator cycling under load. Happens when the ambient temperature drops below -70. "Wait, it's -70 outside?" Miller asked, his expression shifting from amused to concerned. -73 as of 2 hours ago, and it's still dropping. Jesus Christ. "Yeah, so maybe don't go outside unless you absolutely have to," Mara said, trying to keep her tone light. "The cold out there right now will freeze exposed skin in under 60 seconds. The lights stabilized, holding steady. Conversation slowly resumed around the tables, but Rhea noticed that people were eating faster now, finishing up their meals and heading back to their quarters earlier than usual. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everyone could feel it. The station had a rhythm, a pattern to daily life that helped keep people sane. When that rhythm broke, when the lights flickered or the generators made strange sounds or the heating system acted up, people noticed. And lately, the rhythm had been breaking more and more often. Something was wrong at Glacier Station, and everyone knew it, even if nobody wanted to talk about it. After dinner, Rhea found Nolan in the observation dome, sitting in the darkness with no lights on. The dome was a hemisphere of reinforced glass that gave you a 360-degree view of the Antarctic landscape, which at this time of year meant you were sitting in the dark looking out at more darkness. But tonight the Aurora Australis was putting on a show, painting the ice in shades of green and purple that looked sick and wrong, like the sky itself had come down with some kind of terminal illness. "You didn't eat much at dinner," Rhea said, settling into the chair next to him. "Wasn't hungry." Outside the dome, the wind made the thick glass creak and groan. Somewhere far off in the darkness, ice shifted with a sound like a distant gunshot thermal stress causing the massive sheets to crack and split. "You want to tell me what's actually bothering you?" Rhea asked, because she'd known Nolan long enough to recognize when he was working himself up to saying something difficult. Besides the fact that we're sitting on top of something that fundamentally shouldn't exist according to everything we know about geology and biology? Yeah, besides that minor detail. Nolan was quiet for a long time, just watching the aurora dance across the sky. Then he pulled out his tablet, called up a graph, and handed it to Rhea. Seismic readings from the subglacial region. I've been tracking them for the past 3 years. Rhea looked at the data, which meant absolutely nothing to her beyond colored lines going up and down. I don't know what I'm looking at here. Movement, thermal activity, vibrations that don't match any known geological process we've ever documented. He zoomed in on the timeline, showing her how the readings had changed over the years. I predicted this, Rhea. 3 years ago, I stood up at a conference in Oslo and told a room full of geophysicists that there was something alive moving under the Antarctic ice. They laughed at me. Some of them literally laughed. You also said it might be a thermal vent, or magma intrusion, or some kind of unknown geological phenomenon. I was hedging my bets because I didn't want to sound completely insane, but I was wrong about the cause, and I'll admit that. What I wasn't wrong about was the movement. He zoomed in further, showing her the frequency of the vibrations. Look at this pattern. It's been increasing steadily for 3 years. Not randomly, steadily, like a progression. Increasing how? Like something waking up, Nolan said quietly. Like something that's been dormant for thousands of years, maybe millions of years, slowly coming back to life. And we just punched a hole right into its bedroom. Rhea felt the cold settle deeper into her bones, and it had nothing to do with the temperature outside. You think the drilling team woke it up? I think the drilling team let it out. Let what out exactly? I don't know what to call it, but Elias does, or at least he thinks he does. That's why he won't leave the lab. He's obsessed with understanding it, and I think it's starting to understand him right back. Rhea looked toward the main station complex, where Lab 3 glowed like a single bright square in the darkness. Tomorrow morning I'm pulling him out of there, and we're sealing that sample in containment. Whatever the hell it is, McMurdo can deal with it. That's above our pay grade. You think they'll actually listen to us? They better, because I'm not dying down here for some piece of rock that moves when you talk to it. Nolan almost smiled at that. It's not a rock, Rhea. I know. They sat together in the darkness, watching the aurora shift and pulse across the sky like something alive. Outside, something deep in the ice made a sound like grinding teeth, and Rhea tried not to think about columns of ice rising out of the ocean, reaching for her ship with frozen fingers. Movement, thermal activity, vibrations that don't match any known geological process we've ever documented. He zoomed in on the timeline, showing her how the readings had changed over the years. I predicted this, Rhea. 3 years ago, I stood up at a conference in Oslo and told a room full of geophysicists that there was something alive moving under the Antarctic ice. They laughed at me. Some of them literally laughed. You also said it might be a thermal vent, or magma intrusion, or some kind of unknown geological phenomenon. I was hedging my bets because I didn't want to sound completely insane, but I was wrong about the cause, and I'll admit that. What I wasn't wrong about was the movement. He zoomed in further, showing her the frequency of the vibrations. Look at this pattern. It's been increasing steadily for 3 years. Not randomly, steadily, like a progression. Increasing how? Like something waking up? Nolan said quietly. Like something that's been dormant for thousands of years, maybe millions of years, slowly coming back to life. And we just punched a hole right into its bedroom. Rhea felt the cold settle deeper into her bones, and it had nothing to do with the temperature outside. You think the drilling team woke it up? I think the drilling team let it out. Let what out, exactly? I don't know what to call it, but Elias does, or at least he thinks he does. That's why he won't leave the lab. He's obsessed with understanding it, and I think it's starting to understand him right back. Rhea looked toward the main station complex, where Lab 3 glowed like a single bright square in the darkness. Tomorrow morning I'm pulling him out of there, and we're sealing that sample in containment. Whatever the hell it is, McMurdo can deal with it. That's above our pay grade. You think they'll actually listen to us? They better, because I'm not dying down here for some piece of rock that moves when you talk to it. Nolan almost smiled at that. It's not a rock, Rhea. I know. They sat together in the darkness, watching the aurora shift and pulse across the sky like something alive. Outside, something deep in the ice made a sound like grinding teeth, and Rhea tried not to think about columns of ice rising out of the ocean, reaching for her ship with frozen fingers. That night, Rhea dreamed about the ocean freezing upward, the same nightmare that had been haunting her for the past year. She was back on the icebreaker Mikhail Somov, standing on the bridge as 300 meters of reinforced steel cut through pack ice like butter. Except in the dream, the ice wasn't pack ice at all, it was something else, something wrong. A column of ice rising straight up out of the black water like a frozen geyser, 50 feet high and still growing, climbing toward the sky with impossible speed. She could hear herself shouting orders in the dream, commanding full reverse, telling the engine room to give her everything they had. The engine screamed in protest, but the column kept rising, kept spreading, ice racing across the surface of the water faster than the ship could retreat. And the worst part, the part that made it a nightmare instead of just a memory, was that the ice looked deliberate. It moved with purpose. It reached for the ship the way fingers reach for something they want to grab. Then it touched the hull, and metal screamed like something alive and in pain. Hull plates buckled and cracked. The ice didn't just freeze the water around the ship, it froze everything. The engines. The crew running across the deck. The air itself seemed to crystallize. In the dream, she made it to the lifeboat, but barely. In reality, she'd been one of 7 survivors out of a crew of 43. She'd watched the Mikhail Somov get swallowed by ice that shouldn't exist, watched grown men freeze mid-step, watched the ocean turn solid in seconds. The Navy said it was a freak phenomenon. Rhea knew better. She woke up in her bunk at 0300, heart pounding, covered in sweat despite the cold that permeated everything at Glacier Station. For a few seconds she didn't know where she was, her mind still trapped in the nightmare, still watching the ice reach for her. Then reality reasserted itself. She was in Antarctica, at a research station, safe, relatively safe, anyway. She pulled on her clothes, thermal layers, fleece jacket, boots, and left her quarters without really deciding to. The corridors were empty at this hour, lit only by red emergency lighting that made everything look like it was painted in old blood. Her footsteps echoed on the metal floor. She found herself outside Lab 3 without consciously meaning to go there, like her feet had made the decision without consulting her brain. Through the reinforced window in the door, she could see Elias Cade still sitting at the microscope, still in exactly the same position he'd been in 14 hours ago, still motionless, still staring. And on the table next to him, the sample dish sat under the bright examination light. The sample inside had grown again. It was easily twice the size it had been that morning, maybe 3 times larger than when they'd first brought it up from the cave. Rhea stood there in the red-lit corridor, watching through the window, and tried to convince herself that what she was seeing was normal, that samples grew, that this was just science happening. But the sample pulsed with a faint internal light, and that wasn't normal at all. The cave was never supposed to be there in the first place. 4 weeks ago, when the drilling team first set up their equipment over what the satellite scans called Solid Ice Formation Alpha 7, they'd expected to punch through layer after layer of compressed snow and ice that had been accumulating for millennia. Ground-penetrating radar had painted the entire region as solid ancient ice compressed so tightly under its own weight that it behaved more like rock than frozen water. They expected resistance. They expected the drill to fight them every meter of the way down. Instead, they got void space. The drill head punched through at exactly 3:17 in the morning. Miller had been running the equipment, working the night shift because that's when the generators had spare capacity for the power-hungry drilling rig. He felt the pressure drop before any of the instruments registered it, that sudden change that told you the drill bit had broken through into empty space. Then warm air rushed up through the borehole, carrying with it a smell that none of them recognized. Something like hot metal and something sharper underneath, chemical and wrong in a way that made your lizard brain scream warnings. "We hit something," Miller had said over the radio, his voice confused and concerned in equal measure. "We've got void space down there, and it's warm." That was 4 weeks ago, and nothing had been normal since. They'd widened the shaft, made it stable enough to lower cameras and sensor packages down into the darkness. The footage that came back showed a cave that made no geological sense, walls that were too smooth, too rounded, like something warm had melted them from the inside out rather than water carving them over millions of years. And the temperature readings made even less sense. The cave measured just below freezing, hovering right around -1 or -2 Celsius. That was impossible. At that depth, buried under 2 kilometers of ice, the temperature should have been -40, maybe -50. The sheer weight of the ice above should have kept everything down there colder than the surface of Mars. But the cave was warm, relatively speaking. Nolan Pierce had watched the camera footage 17 times before saying anything to anyone. Then he'd pulled Rhea aside, taken her somewhere private, and shown her what the cameras had captured. "I predicted movement in the ice," he'd said, his voice tight with something between vindication and dread. "Shifts, thermal anomalies, vibrations. But I didn't predict this. I couldn't have predicted this." "Predicted what, exactly?" Rhea had asked, looking at the footage of those 2 smooth walls. "Something made that cave, Rhea. Something that generates its own heat. Something that melted its way through solid ice. Like a volcanic vent? Or magma intrusion? No." He'd looked at her with absolute certainty in his eyes, like something alive. Rhea had authorized the sample collection because it was standard protocol. You find something anomalous, you take samples, you study them, you report your findings to the people who get paid more than you to make the big decisions. Standard operating procedure. But standard operating procedure didn't account for samples that grew when you weren't looking, or samples that responded to sound, or samples that seemed to watch you through a microscope while you tried to watch them. Standard operating procedure was starting to feel like it might not apply anymore. Elias K. didn't show up for the morning briefing, which wasn't surprising but was concerning enough that Rhea decided to address it directly. She stood at the front of the common room at 0800, looking at the assembled team, 12 faces, all of them showing signs of stress and sleep deprivation. The drilling crew looked exhausted from their work. The science staff looked worried. Everyone looked like they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Update on the subglacial sample," Rhea began, keeping her voice level and professional. "Dr. Cade has been conducting analysis for the past 9 days. Initial findings indicate that the material is not biological in any conventional sense that we currently understand." "What the hell does that mean?" Miller asked from the back of the room. "It means we don't know what it is yet, and we're being careful until we do know." "But is it dangerous?" someone else asked. Rhea looked at Nolan, who was sitting off to the side. He gave her a slight nod, permission to proceed. "We're treating it as potentially hazardous until we can determine otherwise," Rhea said. "Effective immediately, Lab 3 is restricted access. Nobody goes in without my direct authorization. No exceptions." Murmurs ran through the group. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "How long are we locked down like this?" someone asked. "Until we understand what we're dealing with and what the appropriate protocols are. Dr. Pierce will be taking over the analysis work. Dr. Cade will be reassigned to other duties. Where is Cade anyway? Chen spoke up from his seat at the drilling crew table. I haven't seen him in days. He's in his quarters, resting, Rhea lied, and she could tell from the looks on some faces that people knew she was lying, but nobody challenged her on it. Any other questions about the safety protocols? Silence. Good. Stay safe, stay warm, and don't go outside unless it's absolutely necessary. Current temperature is -76 and dropping. Dismissed. The team filed out slowly, people talking in low voices, shooting worried glances at each other. Mara lingered near the back, waiting until everyone else had left. You really think Elias is in his quarters? She asked quietly. No. Then why lie about it? Because the truth is worse than the lie right now. Which is... Rhea pulled up the security feed on her tablet, showing Mara the camera view of Lab 3. Elias Cade sat at the microscope, exactly where he'd been for the past 15 hours, possibly longer. He hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't used the bathroom, just sat there, staring into the microscope. Jesus, Mara whispered. I don't think Elias is in control anymore, Rhea said quietly. I think something else is driving him now, and I don't know how to stop it. Nolan found Elias in Lab 3 at 8:30, still hunched over the same microscope he'd been glued to for what was now approaching 16 hours straight. The sample dish sat under the examination light, and Nolan noticed immediately that something had changed. The dish itself was cracked, fine lines spreading across the glass like a spider web. And the sample inside had grown again and was easily the size of a golf ball now, when it had been barely larger than a pebble when they'd first brought it up from the cave. Cade, Nolan said, his voice echoing in the white-walled lab. No response. Elias didn't move, didn't even seem to register that someone had entered the room. Elias, Nolan tried again, walking closer. Elias straightened up slowly, like his spine had forgotten how to unbend properly. He blinked several times, then turned to look at Nolan with eyes that didn't seem to focus quite right. His appearance was shocking up-close, bloodshot eyes with dark circles underneath that made him look 20 years older than he actually was, skin so pale it was almost translucent. Cheekbones standing out sharp because he'd lost at least 10 pounds in the past week. His hands trembled when he lifted them from the microscope controls. You need to eat something, Nolan said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the alarm bells going off in his head. And sleep. When's the last time you actually slept? It's growing, Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. Growing faster now. What is? The sample. Elias gestured at the microscope with one shaking hand. You need to look at this, Nolan. You need to see what it's doing. Nolan didn't want to look. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to grab Elias and drag him out of this lab, get him to the medical bay, pump him full of vitamins and sedatives and whatever else it would take to break this obsession. But he was a scientist, and scientists looked at data even when they didn't want to. He leaned over the microscope, adjusted the focus, and looked. The sample appeared crystalline at first glance, all geometric angles and translucent structures that caught the light in strange ways. But as Nolan watched, the structures inside the sample shifted and rearranged themselves. Not randomly, there was a pattern to it, a deliberate reorganization that looked almost like problem-solving, like watching someone work through a puzzle, testing different configurations until they found one that fit. That's not possible, Nolan said, even though he was watching it happen right in front of him. It's happening anyway, Elias replied. What is this thing? I don't know yet. Elias rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms, and Nolan noticed that his hands were shaking worse now. It's not biological. Not in any way we understand biology. No cells, no DNA, no proteins, no organic molecules at all, but it responds to stimuli, Heat makes it grow faster. Pressure makes it reorganize its structure. And sound, he trailed off. Sound what? Talk to it, Elias said. Just say something. Anything. You're joking. I'm not joking, Nolan. Just talk to it. Nolan leaned closer to the sample, feeling ridiculous. Hello? The structures inside the sample shifted immediately, realigning themselves like iron filings responding to a magnet. But there was more to it than that. The sample pulsed once, a faint throb of light from somewhere deep inside its crystalline structure. Like a heartbeat, except things that weren't alive didn't have heartbeats. Jesus Christ, Nolan whispered, jerking back from the microscope. It's been doing that for 3 days now, Elias said, and there was something in his voice that Nolan couldn't quite identify. Pride? Wonder? Fear? Maybe all three. Every time someone speaks near it, the internal patterns change. They get faster, more complex, more organized. It's learning our language, Nolan. It's learning how to understand us. Did you tell Rhea about this? Not yet. Why the hell not? This is exactly the kind of thing she needs to know about. Because she'll destroy it, Elias said, and now Nolan could hear the obsession clearly in his voice. She'll seal it in containment or shoot it out an airlock or do whatever her security protocols tell her to do, and I need to understand it first. I need to know what it is, where it came from, what it wants. We don't even know if it wants anything. It might just be responding to stimuli like a plant responding to light. Plants don't learn, Elias said quietly. This thing is learning, and I think it's trying to communicate. Nolan stepped back from the microscope, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to consider. This is exactly how people die in horror movies, Cade. The scientist who needs just one more day to understand the alien artifact before sealing it up. That scientist always dies. This isn't a movie. No, you're right. It's worse, because this is real and we're stuck in Antarctica with no way out if this goes wrong. Nolan headed for the door. I'm telling Rhea everything, and we're locking this thing down right now, today, before it gets any worse. There's nobody smarter than us, Elias said to Nolan's back, his voice soft and strange. That's the real problem. We're the experts they sent to study this. If we can't figure it out, nobody can. Nolan stopped at the door and turned back. Elias was smiling, and there was something wrong with that smile. His teeth looked darker than they should be, almost gray in the harsh laboratory light. Get some sleep, Elias, Nolan said. That's not a request. But as he left the lab, he had the distinct feeling that Elias wasn't going to sleep, and that smile, that wrong, gray-toothed smile, stayed with him all the way back to the security office. Rhea called an emergency meeting at 0900 sharp, and this time the tension in the common room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Station personnel crammed into the space, all 12 of them, because at Glacier Station during winter there was nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. The drilling crew sat on one side, the science staff on the other, and the support personnel filled in the gaps. Everyone looked tired, stressed, and more than a little scared. We've got a situation that needs to be addressed, Rhea began, standing at the front of the room in her unofficial position of authority. The sample from the subglacial cave is exhibiting behavior that we don't fully understand and can't predict. Until we know exactly what we're dealing with and what the risks are, Lab 3 is now under restricted access. Nobody goes in without my direct authorization, and that includes science staff. What kind of behavior are we talking about? Miller asked, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Nolan stood up to answer that one. The sample is responsive to external stimuli, particularly sound. It's also adaptive. Its internal structure reorganizes in response to different inputs. We don't know if it's dangerous, but we're not taking any chances until we understand it better. It's a rock, one of the drilling crew said dismissively. How dangerous can a rock possibly be? It's not a rock, Elias said from the corner of the room. Everyone turned to look at him. He'd shown up about 5 minutes late to the meeting, wearing his coat with the hood up despite the fact that they were inside. He stood in the shadows near the back wall, hands shoved deep in his pockets, and there was something off about the way he was standing. Too still, maybe. Too rigid. Then what is it? Rhea asked carefully. Something else, Elias said. Something that shouldn't exist according to our current understanding of physics and biology and chemistry, but it exists anyway. The room went completely silent. People exchanged nervous glances. Rhea studied Elias, really looked at him for the first time in days. His eyes were different, darker, with the whites taking on a faint grayish tinge that might have been exhaustion or might have been something worse. His skin had that strange, translucent quality you sometimes saw in people who'd been underground too long, like you could almost see the blood moving beneath the surface. "Dr. Cade," Rhea said, keeping her voice level and professional even though alarm bells were ringing in her head. "You have 48 hours to compile your findings and submit a full report. After that, we're sealing the sample in proper containment and shipping it to McMurdo Station for analysis by specialists. Is that clear?" Elias didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something that nobody else could hear. The movement was wrong, too precise, too mechanical, like a bird tracking a sound. "Is that clear, Dr. Cade?" Rhea repeated, putting steel in her voice. "Clear," Elias said finally, but his voice sounded different than it had a week ago. There was something layered about it now, like two people speaking in almost perfect unison, creating a weird harmonic effect that made Rhea's skin crawl. The meeting broke up shortly after that, people filing out in small groups and talking in low, worried voices. Mara caught up with Rhea in the hallway outside the common room. "Did his voice sound weird to you?" Mara asked quietly. "Everything about him seems weird right now. What are we going to do about it?" Rhea thought about protocols and procedures, about chain of command and medical authority. "I'm going to give him 24 hours to pull himself together. If he's not better by tomorrow, I'm sedating him and putting him on medical leave. We can't have someone that unstable working with an unknown sample. And if he refuses, then I'll sedate him anyway and deal with the paperwork later," Rhea said grimly. "I've lost too many people to weird shit in the ice. I'm not losing anyone else at this station." Chen disappeared on day 12, and everything changed. He was part of the drilling crew, a quiet guy in his early 30s who kept mostly to himself and worked harder than anyone else on his shift. David Chen, born in California to immigrant parents, married with 2 kids back in Sacramento. He'd volunteered for Antarctica because the money was good enough to finally get his daughter the orthodontic work she needed, and because 8 months away meant 8 months of hazard pay. He'd volunteered to retrieve a dropped sensor package from the subglacial access tunnel because that's the kind of guy he was: reliable, uncomplaining, willing to do the jobs nobody else wanted. Routine maintenance, nothing dangerous. He'd done it a dozen times before. His radio crackled at 1400 hours. "Got the sensor. Heading back up now." Those were the last words anyone heard from him. When he didn't emerge from the tunnel after an hour, Rhea organized a search team. She took Nolan and Miller with her, all of them suiting up in full thermal gear, grabbing powerful lights and backup radios. They descended into the access shaft that led down to the cave, moving carefully on metal rungs that were slick with frost. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, barely wide enough for one person to move through at a time. Ice walls pressed in from all sides, and their breath fogged in great clouds despite the respirators. The temperature gauge on Rhea's wrist unit read -42 Celsius and dropping as they descended. The beams from their headlamps cut through the darkness, revealing ice that looked almost blue in the artificial light. They found Chen 6 hours into the search, sitting against the tunnel wall about 200 meters down from the cave entrance. He was sitting upright with his back against the ice, his helmet removed and sitting beside him on the tunnel floor. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His face was peaceful, almost serene, like he just decided to sit down for a rest and then forgotten to stand back up. But his chest didn't rise and fall. There was no fog of breath coming from his mouth and nose. "Jesus," Miller whispered, his voice crackling over the radio. Rhea knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find. Chen's skin was frozen solid, hard as marble, and cold enough to burn her glove when she touched his neck. His face had that expression that she'd seen before on people who died from exposure, a kind of terminal peacefulness. The face of someone whose hypothermia had progressed far enough that their dying brain convinced them they were warm and safe. "Help me get him back to the surface," Rhea said, keeping her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. Moving a frozen body through a narrow tunnel turned out to be harder than any of them expected. Chen's body was rigid in that sitting position, frozen in place, and they had to angle him carefully through the access shaft like they were moving an awkward piece of furniture. It took them 2 hours to get him back up to the station level, and by the time they laid him out in the medical bay, all 3 of them were exhausted and rattled. Rhea called it into McMurdo Station on the emergency frequency fatality, probable equipment failure leading to exposure, investigation pending. The voice on the other end took down the details in a flat, professional tone that suggested this kind of thing happened often enough that they had a standard form for it. Then Rhea left Nolan to do the medical examination, because she'd seen enough dead bodies in her career and she didn't need to see another one. She should have stayed. She should have watched what Nolan found. Because what was inside David Chen changed everything. Nolan found Rhea in the security office 2 hours later, and his face was the color of old snow. "You need to see this," he said, and his voice was shaking. "I really don't want to see it, Nolan. Rhea, you need to see this right now." She followed him back to the medical bay, where Chen's body was still laid out on the examination table. The room was cold. They kept it that way to preserve the body until transport could be arranged, and it smelled like antiseptic and something else underneath, something chemical and wrong. Nolan had removed Chen's jacket and thermal layers, carefully cutting through the frozen fabric. The skin underneath looked normal at first glance, pale from cold and death, but otherwise unremarkable. Then Rhea looked closer and saw what had made Nolan's face go white. The skin was intact, no visible wounds or trauma, but underneath the skin, something was very wrong. The flesh had a strange texture to it, almost translucent, like looking at frosted glass. And there were patterns in the tissue, geometric shapes that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. "What am I looking at?" Rhea asked, even though part of her already knew and didn't want to know. "I don't know," Nolan said, and he was actively shaking now. "But it gets worse." He pulled back the sheet covering Chen's torso. He'd made a standard Y incision for the autopsy, the kind medical examiners made when they needed to examine internal organs. Except there were no organs to examine. Chen was hollow inside. Not empty in the way a body was empty after organs were removed, hollow in the way a building was hollow, with smooth walls and careful architecture. His organs were gone, dissolved or absorbed or somehow transformed into something else entirely. The cavity of his chest looked polished, almost crystalline, like someone had taken the time to smooth every surface to a mirror finish. Rhea could see faint geometric patterns etched into the inner walls of what had been Chen's chest cavity, patterns that pulsed with a dim internal light. The cavity itself was lined with that same translucent material from the sample grown throughout Chen's body like crystalline veins spreading through tissue. It looked organic and inorganic at the same time, like someone had tried to build a machine out of flesh or grow flesh from a machine and ended up with something that was neither and both. Rhea felt her stomach try to crawl up her throat. What the fuck did this? "There's more." Nolan's voice was barely above a whisper now. He pointed to Chen's hands. to his fingers specifically. The fingernails were black, not bruised black or frostbite black, black like obsidian, like polished stone. They had a crystalline quality to them, geometric facets catching the light like cut gems. And they were warm to the touch, Nolan explained, his words coming faster now as if he needed to get this out before he lost his nerve, not frozen like the rest of the body. Warm, actually generating heat. How long has he been dead? Rhea managed to ask through the tightness in her throat. That's the thing, Nolan said, and his eyes were terrified when he looked at her. I don't think he froze to death at all. I think something consumed him from the inside out, dissolved his organs one by one, replaced his tissue with whatever that is. And based on the heat signatures I'm getting, I think whatever did it is still inside the body, still active, still growing. As if the universe had been waiting for exactly that moment to prove Nolan right, Chen's fingers twitched. Both of them jumped back from the table, Rhea's hand going automatically to her sidearm. The fingers curled slowly, joints bending with a faint crackling sound like ice breaking. Then they uncurled, spreading wide. Then curled again, each movement more controlled than the last, like someone learning how to use them for the first time, working out the mechanics of finger movement through trial and error. Then Chen's eyes opened. Not his human eyes, those were gone, dissolved like everything else organic that had made him David Chen. These were different eyes, completely black from edge to edge, crystalline and faceted like the inside of a geode. They didn't move in their sockets the way human eyes moved, they just were, fixed and staring. His mouth opened with a wet sound, jaw unhinging wider than human jaws were meant to go, revealing a throat that looked like the inside of the cave, all smooth crystalline surfaces reflecting the light. Then a sound came out rasping, mechanical, layered with harmonics that made Rhea's teeth ache. Help, it said in Chen's voice, but wrong. The word came out in multiple pitches at once, like a choir singing in dissonant harmony. Please help me. Rhea had her sidearm out and pointed at the thing on the table before she even realized she'd drawn it, her training taking over when her conscious mind was still trying to process what she was seeing. Chen, the thing wearing Chen's body like an ill-fitting suit, sat up on the examination table. The Y incision in his chest should have been catastrophic, should have left him unable to move, should have been fatal. Instead, the edges of the wound were already sealing themselves, flesh knitting together like wet clay being smoothed by invisible hands, the crystalline material filling the gap and restructuring the tissue. Step away from the table, Rhea ordered, her voice hard and cold and deadly calm despite the terror screaming through her veins. The thing turned its head toward her with movements that were too precise, too mechanical, like a camera on a motorized mount. Those black crystalline eyes focused on her, and she could see her own reflection in their faceted surfaces, distorted and multiplied 1,000 times over. Commander Volkov, it said, still in that layered Chen voice. Something is wrong with me. I cannot feel my hands properly. I cannot feel anything the way I should. You're not Chen. I am David Chen, drilling specialist, employee number 74392, married to Jennifer Chen, father to Mei Chen, age 8, and Lily Chen, age 6. The thing recited the facts perfectly, without hesitation, like reading from a personnel file. Chen is dead. I am not dead. I am here. I am speaking to you. I am moving. The thing stood up from the table, legs bending at angles that weren't quite right, knees flexing backward for a moment before correcting, like someone who'd learned about human anatomy from a diagram but had never actually used these particular limbs. It took a step toward Rhea and Nolan, movements getting smoother with each second as it learned. Rhea fired. The 9mm round hit center mass, exactly where she'd aimed it. punching through the thing's chest with a spray of matter that looked nothing like blood, crystalline fragments and something viscous and clear that caught the light like broken glass suspended in gel. The impact knocked it backward, made it stumble, arms pinwheeling for balance. Then it looked down at the hole in its chest, seemed to study it with something like curiosity, head tilting at that mechanical angle. "Why did you shoot me?" it asked, sounding genuinely confused, like Rhea had just done something inexplicable. "I am not threatening you. I am requesting assistance." The wound was already closing, edges pulling together, new tissue forming to fill the gap. Rhea watched in horror as the hole sealed itself in under 10 seconds, leaving only a small dark mark on the chest to show where the bullet had entered. "Run," she said to Nolan, and grabbed him by the arm, pulling him toward the door. They ran. Behind them, the thing wearing Chen's body called after them in that perfect, terrible voice that sounded so much like Chen and yet nothing like him at all. "Please don't leave me. I don't understand what's happening to me. I need help. Please." The voice was so human, so desperate, so perfectly modulated to convey fear and confusion that it made Rhea's skin crawl, because she knew they both knew with absolute certainty that whatever was speaking wasn't Chen anymore. Chen was gone, consumed, his body repurposed as a vessel for something that had learned how to wear his face and use his voice and mimic his mannerisms. They made it to the corridor and Rhea sealed the medical bay door remotely from her wrist unit, slamming the magnetic locks into place with a heavy clang. The thing pounded on the door from inside, and its voice carried through the intercom speaker mounted on the wall. "Commander, please. I'm scared. I don't know what's happening to me. Why won't you help me?" But the footsteps on the other side of the door weren't right. Too heavy, too slow, too deliberate. Like something that weighed more than a human should, moving with a gait that was learning to mimic walking but hadn't quite mastered it yet. Like something that had never walked on 2 legs before yesterday. Content continues with the rest of the story through the ending, McMurdo integration, and folklore note. Due to length limits, I'll create this as the main file and continue with the outro in a separate file. Rhea sealed the medical bay remotely and got everyone who wasn't absolutely necessary away from that section of the station. Then she pulled up the security feed on the main monitor in the security office, where Mara and the remaining survivors were crowded around watching with growing horror. The thing that had been Chen stood in the center of the medical bay, no longer pounding on the door. It was just standing there, motionless, head tilted at that weird mechanical angle, looking directly at the camera with those black crystalline eyes. "That's Chen," Mara said, her voice small and scared and wanting desperately to believe it. "That's his face, his body. That's really him. That's not Chen," Rhea said flatly, with absolute certainty. "Chen is dead. That's something else wearing him like a costume." On the feed, the thing stopped moving entirely for several seconds. Then it stepped back from the door in a movement that was suddenly much smoother, much more controlled. It had been learning, Rhea realized with growing dread. In the few minutes since it had animated Chen's body, it had gone from jerky, uncertain movements to fluid, controlled motion. It looked directly into the camera with those faceted black eyes, and Rhea had the distinct impression it could see her watching. And then it smiled. The smile was wrong too wide, stretching Chen's face in ways human facial muscles shouldn't stretch, revealing teeth that were starting to darken and take on that same crystalline quality as the fingernails. "I understand now," it said through the intercom, its voice suddenly much calmer, much more controlled than before. The desperate pleading tone was gone, replaced by something cool and analytical. "You're afraid. That's a natural biological response to encountering something unknown. But there's nothing to be afraid of, Commander Volkov. This is not a hostile action. This is improvement. This is evolution in progress. This is better. Turn it off, Rhea said quietly. Kill the video feed. Kill the audio. Mara reached for the controls, but the thing spoke again before she could cut the connection. You can't keep me isolated in this room forever, Commander. And even if you could, there are others now. The sample has been growing, spreading through the station's environmental systems for days, through the ventilation, through the water reclamation system, through the food preparation equipment. You've all been exposed already, everyone at this station. The transformation is simply a matter of time now. The process has already begun inside each of you, rebuilding you cell by cell, improving you from the inside out. Soon everyone will understand. Soon everyone will welcome what comes next. Rhea yanked the intercom cable from the wall with enough force to tear the mounting bracket loose, cutting off the voice mid-sentence. Silence filled the security office, heavy and oppressive. She looked at the terrified faces around her, Nolan with his face still white from the autopsy, Mara with her eyes wide and unbelieving, Miller gripping the edge of the console like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Rodriguez and 2 technicians whose names Rhea kept forgetting in the midst of all this horror. 7 people. 7 people who might or might not already be infected with whatever had hollowed out David Chen and learned how to pilot his corpse like a meat puppet. We're evacuating, Rhea said, making the decision in the moment and refusing to second-guess it even though every option looked like a different flavor of death. Right now. We're getting out of this station. Evacuate to where? Miller asked, his voice higher and tighter than normal. Commander, the nearest base is McMurdo, and that's 800 kilometers of frozen wasteland. We'll freeze solid before we make it 10 kilometers in this weather. Then we call for extraction before we leave. Mara was already pulling up the communications interface, her fingers flying over the keyboard with the desperate speed of someone who knew time was running out. Then her face went pale and slack and Rhea knew what she was going to say before she said it. Oh no. What? But Rhea already knew. She could feel it, that sinking certainty of a bad situation getting catastrophically worse. The comms array. It's offline. Equipment failure? No. Mara pulled up the diagnostic readouts, her hands starting to shake as she read the data. Someone cut the power, manually, from outside the station. They physically destroyed the power coupling. Rhea felt the cold settle into her bones, and it had nothing to do with the Antarctic winter raging outside. This was the cold of realization, the cold of understanding that you were already trapped in the jaws of something vast and patient, and it had been closing those jaws slowly for days while you didn't notice. Elias, she said, certain of it now. You think he sabotaged our communications. I think whatever Elias has become sabotaged our communications, Rhea corrected. I think that thing knew exactly what it was doing, isolating us, cutting us off from rescue, giving itself time to spread. She grabbed her coat from the back of her chair, started pulling it on with quick, economical movements. Mara, you're with me. We're going outside to fix that array manually. Everyone else stays here and barricades this door. Don't let anything in. Don't open it for anyone, not me, not Mara, not God himself unless they give you the password. What password? Nolan asked, already moving to help stack furniture against the door. Rhea thought for exactly 2 seconds, pulling up a memory that still gave her nightmares. Mikhail Somov. That's the only password that gets this door opened. Anything else? You assume whoever's on the other side isn't human anymore. What does Mikhail Somov mean? Rodriguez asked. It means we're fucked unless we move fast and get lucky, Rhea said bluntly, checking the charge on her sidearm even though she knew bullets wouldn't help against whatever was loose in the station. Mara, suit up. We've got maybe 10 minutes before those things figure out how to bypass the locks, and I want to be outside and moving before that happens. As they headed for the airlock, Rhea heard the sound of furniture being stacked against the door behind them, tables, chairs, equipment racks, anything heavy enough to slow down something that was stronger than it should be. She didn't blame them one bit. She'd be barricading herself in too, if she had the luxury of staying inside where it was warm. The cold outside was like stepping through a doorway into a different universe where the fundamental laws of physics had been rewritten specifically to kill human beings as efficiently as possible. -78 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that didn't just hurt, it burned, it cut. It found every microscopic gap in your thermal suit and exploited it like a living thing searching for weaknesses. Wind gusting at 40 knots, strong enough to knock a person off their feet if they weren't braced for it. Strong enough to turn the blowing snow into a weapon that scoured exposed surfaces and reduced visibility to almost nothing. The darkness was absolute except for the weak beams of their headlamps, which barely penetrated 10 meters into the white wall of wind-driven snow. Rhea and Mara moved through the maelstrom like ghosts, their thermal suits the only thing standing between them and death by exposure in under 2 minutes. Every breath burned going down despite the respirator, the cold air searing Rhea's lungs, making her throat raw. Her fingers went numb almost immediately despite the insulated gloves rated for these exact conditions. Her toes weren't far behind, and she could feel the cold starting to work its way through the suit's insulation at her knees and elbows where the fabric flexed. The communications array was 200 meters from the main station. In normal conditions, with good visibility and no wind, it would have been a 5-minute walk. In this, it might as well have been on the surface of Mars. They trudged forward through knee-deep snow, fighting for every meter, following the guide rope that had been strung between the station and the array for exactly this kind of emergency maintenance. Without that rope, they'd be lost in seconds, wandering blind in the white until the cold took them and they became permanent fixtures of the Antarctic landscape. It took them 15 minutes to cover 200 meters, fighting the wind every step of the way, and by the time they finally reached the array, Rhea's entire body was shaking from cold and exertion. Her hands were numb claws inside her gloves. Her feet felt like blocks of ice attached to her legs. The temperature warning on her wrist display was flashing red, telling her things she already knew, that she was dangerously close to hypothermia, that exposed skin would freeze in under 30 seconds, that she was operating in conditions that human beings were never meant to survive in. The damage to the power coupling was immediately obvious, and immediately, terrifyingly wrong. Someone had torn it apart, not cut the wires with tools, not damaged it through some equipment failure, physically torn it apart with what looked like bare hands. The heavy metal housing was twisted and deformed in ways that would have required thousands of pounds of force. Cables as thick as Rhea's thumb were snapped clean through, the broken ends still sparking faintly in the darkness. The entire coupling had been ripped away from its mounting bracket and thrown several meters into the snow, where it lay half buried like a piece of broken sculpture. "Jesus Christ," Mara said over the suit radio, her voice crackling with static and something that might have been terror. "What the hell did this? This housing is reinforced steel. You'd need hydraulic tools to tear it apart like this." "Elias did this," Rhea said, though she knew that wasn't quite accurate anymore. Whatever Elias had become, whatever that thing in the lab had turned him into, with strength that had nothing to do with human muscle and bone. "Can we fix it?" Mara pulled tools from the emergency kit on her belt, examining the damage with her headlamp while her hands shook from cold, from fear, probably from both. "Maybe. Give me 10 minutes. Maybe 15. I'll have to jury-rig a new coupling from spare parts and hope it holds long enough to send a distress call. Make it 5 minutes. I'll make it as fast as I can without electrocuting both of us or starting a fire that'll burn through the suit insulation," Mara said, already pulling out cables and connectors, working with the desperate speed of someone who knew their life depended on doing this right the first time. Rhea turned away from Mara's work, scanning the darkness with her headlamp. The wind howled across the ice like something alive and angry, a sound that was almost but not quite like screaming. The station lights looked impossibly small and distant, yellow squares in the darkness that seemed to recede further away with every passing second. Out here in the dark, surrounded by howling wind and killing cold, it was easy to believe that the station didn't exist anymore, that she and Mara were the last two people alive in the entire world, alone on a frozen planet that wanted them dead. Then something moved in the darkness beyond her headlamp's reach. She couldn't see it clearly at first, just a shape, tall and wrong, moving in ways that didn't match human locomotion. Too smooth in some movements, too jerky in others, like watching a stop-motion animation that was missing random frames. The shape moved closer with patient deliberation, and Rhea felt her hand go to her sidearm even though she knew bullets wouldn't stop whatever was out there. "Mara," Rhea said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I see it," Mara replied, not looking up from her work, her hands moving faster now, pulling and connecting cables with the kind of focused intensity that came from forcing yourself not to panic. The shape moved closer still, slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world and knew they didn't. It stopped just outside the cone of light from their headlamps, close enough that Rhea could make out a silhouette but not details, close enough to attack if it wanted to. But it just stood there, watching, waiting. "Commander Volkov," a voice said, and it was Elias's voice but layered with dozens of other voices speaking in perfect harmony, creating a sound that was beautiful and horrible at the same time. "You should step away from the communications array. This is futile resistance to an inevitable process." "Fuck you, Cade," Rhea said, and meant every syllable. "You don't understand what we're offering you. What we're offering all of humanity. We are not hostile, Commander. We are not trying to cause harm. We're trying to help, to improve, to evolve, to integrate you into something greater than you could ever be alone. By killing us? That's your idea of improvement? We're not killing anyone. We're transforming them, making them better, stronger, immune to cold, to hunger, to disease, to the limitations of biological existence, immune to death itself." The voice was calm, reasonable, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. David Chen understood this at the end, in those final moments before his transformation completed. He welcomed the change. He saw what he was becoming and he embraced it. Chen is dead. Chen is transformed. He still exists, his memories, his personality, his knowledge, everything that made him David Chen. He remembers his wife, his daughters, his life, but now he's part of something greater than himself. And soon you will be too. Soon everyone will be. This is not a threat, Commander. This is an invitation. This is the future of your species. The shape moved closer, stepping into the light now where Rhea could see it clearly. It was Elias, or it had been Elias. His skin had that same translucent quality as Chen's body after transformation, like looking at wax held up to strong light, where you could almost but not quite see the structures moving underneath. His eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all, just those crystalline voids that reflected her headlamp like mirrors, multiplying the light into 1,000 tiny stars. His mouth was open too wide, jaw dislocated to an angle that should have shattered the bone but somehow didn't, revealing a throat that looked like the inside of a geode. All geometric facets and crystalline surfaces. "You can't stop this," it said with Elias's voice. "It's already happening. The sample has been spreading throughout the station for weeks, in the air you breathe, in the water you drink, in every surface you touch. You're all infected already, Commander. Every person at Glacier Station. The crystalline structures are growing inside you right now, replacing your cells one by one, improving you from the inside out. It's just a matter of time before the transformation becomes visible, before you understand what you're becoming. 3 more minutes, Mara said, her voice tight with controlled panic, hands moving faster now, almost fumbling in her haste. We don't have 3 minutes, Rhea replied. The Elias thing lunged forward with speed that shouldn't have been possible from something that looked like a walking corpse, crossing the distance between them in 2 bounding leaps that covered nearly 3 meters each. Rhea fired her sidearm, once, twice, 3 times. The 9mm rounds punched through the thing's torso, through the thermal suit it was still wearing and the flesh beneath, creating holes that should have been immediately fatal, that should have dropped it in its tracks. The thing stumbled, fell to one knee in the snow, then stood back up like nothing had happened, like getting shot 3 times was a minor inconvenience rather than a death sentence. In the light of the headlamps, Rhea could see the wounds already closing, flesh knitting together with that same wet clay smoothness she'd seen in the medical bay, new tissue forming to fill the gaps where the bullets had torn through. The thing wasn't bleeding, there was no blood, just that clear, viscous fluid that looked like liquid crystal. You're only making this harder on yourself, the thing said, and lunged again. This time it grabbed her, hands clamping around her upper arms with inhuman strength that dented the reinforced fabric of her thermal suit. She felt the pressure on her arms, felt the suit's environmental seal starting to give way under the force of that grip, felt the cold trying to rush in through the gap. If her suit breached out here, she'd be dead in under a minute. Mara, now. It's not ready. The connections aren't. I don't care if it's ready, do it now. Mara jammed the jury-rigged power coupling together with shaking hands, not bothering to check the connections, not worrying about whether it would hold, just forcing the pieces together and hoping for the best. Sparks flew in a brilliant cascade of orange light that looked almost beautiful against the darkness. The communications array came online with a surge of electricity that Rhea could feel through the ground, could feel through the air itself like static on her skin. And the Elias thing screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something mechanical and wet and full of harmonics that shouldn't exist in nature. A scream that came from a throat that had been restructured for purposes other than human speech. A sound that made Rhea's teeth ache and her inner ear rebel against impossible frequencies. It let go of her and stumbled backward, hands clutching at its head like something inside was causing it pain, like the electrical surge had done something to whatever was controlling that body. "Run!" Mara shouted, abandoning her tools, not even bothering to secure the coupling, just running. They ran. Behind them, the thing recovered quickly, its scream cutting off as it regained control of the stolen body. Its footsteps crunched in the snow, heavy, deliberate, mechanical, gaining on them faster than should have been possible. But they were faster, driven by pure terror and the survival instinct that had kept humans alive through millions of years of running from things that wanted to eat them. They reached the airlock and Mara punched in the emergency override code with fingers that barely worked anymore, too numb from cold and terror to feel the keypad. The door cycled open and they tumbled inside, hitting the seal button before they'd even fully cleared the threshold. The outer door slammed shut with a heavy clang that echoed through the small space. Through the reinforced window, Rhea could see the thing that had been Elias standing outside in the darkness and the blowing snow. It walked up to the door with that too smooth gait, moving like it was learning to make walking look more natural with each step, refining its performance. It pressed one hand against the reinforced glass, and Rhea could see the crystalline structures growing under the skin, geometric patterns spreading through the flesh like frost on a window. The glass cracked. A single hairline fracture spreading from where the thing's palm pressed against the surface, spreading outward in a slow spiderweb pattern. "Jesus Christ," Mara whispered, pressing herself against the far wall of the airlock. But the thing didn't try to break through. It had the strength Rhea had seen what it could do to reinforce steel, had felt that inhuman grip on her arms. It could have punched through that window if it wanted to, but it didn't. It just stood there for a long moment, watching them with those black, crystalline eyes. Then it smiled that wrong, too wide smile that stretched Elias's face into something that wasn't quite human anymore. And then it turned away, walking back toward the darkness with movements that were getting smoother and more controlled with each passing second. Learning, always learning, and disappeared into the blowing snow like it had never been there at all. Rhea's radio crackled with static, then cleared enough for her to hear McMurdo Station's response. Glacier Station, this is McMurdo. We copy your code black. What is your current situation? Over. Rhea pressed the transmit button with fingers that were just starting to regain feeling, the pain of returning circulation making her wince. McMurdo. Glacier Station. We have an unknown hostile entity at this location. Adaptive intelligence, possibly infectious, multiple casualties. Station infrastructure is compromised. We need immediate evacuation. Repeat, we need immediate evacuation. Over. Copy that, Glacier. Stand by. A pause filled with static. Then, be advised, current weather conditions prevent immediate aerial response. Evac team will be airborne at first available window. Current ETA 6 hours from now at earliest. Can you hold position for 6 hours? Over. 6 hours. They had to survive 6 more hours in a station that had been infiltrated by something that could wear human skin like a suit, that was spreading through the environmental systems, that might have already infected everyone who was still breathing. 6 hours before help arrived. If they could even survive that long. Affirmative, McMurdo. We'll hold position. Be advised, recommend full quarantine protocols on arrival. We may be contaminated. Repeat, possible contamination of personnel. Medical teams should be standing by. Over. Understood, Glacier. Quarantine protocols will be in effect. Hang in there. Help is coming. McMurdo out. The line went dead, leaving nothing but the hiss of static. Rhea and Mara made it back to the security office, moving through corridors that felt different now, like the station itself had changed in some fundamental way while they were outside. The walls looked the same, the lights still worked, everything appeared normal, but it felt wrong, like walking through a place that had been perfectly replicated but with some essential quality missing. They reached the security office door and Rhea knocked, her pattern deliberate, 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick again. Password, Nolan's voice demanded from inside, tense and ready. Mikhail Somov. The door unsealed and they stumbled inside. 7 faces looked back at them, Nolan, Miller, Rodriguez, and 4 others whose names Rhea kept losing in the chaos. We got through to McMurdo, Rhea said, pulling off her helmet, her face numb from cold. Evac in 6 hours. 6 hours, Miller repeated, like he was trying to convince himself it was real, that they actually had a chance. We can do 6 hours, right? But Rhea wasn't sure they could, because when she pulled up the security feeds on the main monitor, she saw them. The entities. Chen, Elias, and 3 others from the drilling crew that must have been transformed while Rhea and Mara were outside fixing the array. All of them walking through the station with that same too smooth gait that was getting more controlled and more natural looking with every passing minute, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested hive intelligence, swarm behavior, collective consciousness. They were learning fast, too fast, and they were everywhere. We're not staying here, Rhea said, making another split-second decision that might save them or might just change the way they died. There's an emergency shelter 3 kilometers south of here. It's stocked, heated, has backup communications in case the main array goes down again. We get there, we seal ourselves in, and we wait for evac. 3 kilometers in this weather? Nolan said, his voice going up half an octave. Commander, that's a death sentence. We'll freeze before we make it halfway. Staying here is also a death sentence, Rhea said bluntly, pointing at the security feed showing the entities moving through the station, searching room by room in systematic patterns. At least out there we die human. We die as ourselves. We don't end up as meat puppets for whatever's loose in this station. She paused, let that sink in, watched the fear on their faces transform into grim determination. We suit up in 5 minutes. We take only what we can carry and move fast. Anyone who can't keep up. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They all understood what she was really saying. If you fall, we leave you. If you slow down, we leave you. If you die, we don't stop to mourn. Because out there in the Antarctic night, stopping meant dying, and dying meant becoming something else entirely. They all understood. Nobody argued. They left through the emergency airlock at 0300, 7 people in thermal suits moving single file through the absolute darkness of Antarctic winter at its worst. Rhea led the way, breaking trail through snow that came up past her knees. Mara was second in line, staying close enough to grab Rhea if she fell. Nolan brought up the rear, making sure nobody fell too far behind. In between were Miller, Rodriguez, and 2 technicians named Jensen and Park. The emergency shelter was 3 kilometers south, which might as well have been 3,000 kilometers given the conditions they were facing. Negative 82 degrees Celsius, a temperature that wanted them dead with active malice. Wind at 50 knots, turning the air into a wall of frozen knives. Visibility effectively 0 in the blowing snow, their headlamps useless beyond a few meters. They had maybe 4 hours until the evac helicopter arrived at the station to find it abandoned. If they could make it to the shelter, if they could survive there, they might make it through this. Might. They ran anyway, because behind them was something worse than cold, worse than death. Behind them was transformation into something that wasn't them anymore. Jensen fell first, about a kilometer out. He just went down in the snow without warning, his legs giving out from under him, and he didn't get back up no matter how hard he tried. Nolan stopped, tried to help him stand. "Keep moving," Rhea shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible even through the suit radio. "We can't just leave him," Nolan shouted back. "If we stop, we all die. Move. That's an order." Nolan hesitated for 3 seconds that felt like forever. 3 seconds where Rhea could see him wrestling with the decision, with his humanity warring against survival instinct. Then he kept running, leaving Jensen behind in the snow. Behind them, Jensen's headlamp stayed on for maybe another minute, a small point of light in the darkness getting smaller and smaller with distance. Then it went dark. Rodriguez fell at kilometer 2. The cold had found a gap in his suit at the left shoulder, and once it got in, it moved fast, spreading through the layers, finding his skin, beginning the process of shutting down his body from the outside in. He tried to keep going, managed another 100 meters on pure adrenaline and willpower before his legs stopped working and he went down face first in the snow. This time, nobody tried to stop. They all knew what it meant. They all understood the arithmetic of survival. 7 became 5. They were down to 5 people when they finally reached the shelter: Rhea, Mara, Nolan, Miller, and Park. The shelter was a metal box half buried in the ice, barely large enough for 5 people, but it had heat, and it had communications, and it had walls between them in the killing cold outside. And right now that was everything that mattered. Rhea's fingers barely worked anymore. Park had to help her with the door mechanism, his own hand shaking so badly he could barely grip the release handle, both of them fumbling with it for precious seconds while the cold tried to kill them. The door finally opened and they tumbled inside into blessed warmth that felt like stepping into a furnace after being frozen. Rhea collapsed against the wall, every muscle in her body screaming, her lungs burning, her hands and feet on fire with the pain of returning circulation. She pulled off her helmet and just breathed for a moment, feeling the warm air on her face, tasting it, almost crying from the relief of being inside, of being alive. "We made it," Mara said, her voice hollow and distant, like she couldn't quite believe it. "We actually made it." "Yeah." Park sat in the corner, not talking, just shaking, staring at nothing while his mind tried to process everything that had happened. "How long until pickup?" Nolan asked, his voice rough from the cold. Rhea checked her watch with hands that were still trembling. 3.5 hours, maybe less if the weather clears enough for them to fly earlier. "We can do 3.5 hours. But even as he said it, Rhea saw movement outside the window. Shapes in the darkness, multiple shapes, surrounding the shelter in a loose circle. The entities had followed them. Of course they had. They came to the windows one by one, pressing their faces against the reinforced glass like children looking into a candy store. Nolan, Chen, Elias, Jensen, already transformed, his skin taking on that translucent quality even though he'd only been dead for an hour. Rodriguez, his eyes already going black. All of them wearing faces that Rhea recognized, all of them with those crystalline eyes that reflected the light from inside the shelter. "Let us in," they said in perfect unison, their voices harmonizing in that wrong way that made your teeth ache and your brain rebel against the sound. "We're cold out here. We're scared. Let us in and we'll help you. Let us make you better. Let us show you what you can become." Park screamed, high and terrified, and ran for the door. "No!" Rhea lunged for him, her hands grabbing at his suit, but he was faster, driven by panic, by the overwhelming need to get away from those faces at the windows. He yanked the door open before anyone could stop him. The entities flowed inside like water finding its level, not rushing, not attacking, just moving with that terrible smooth grace that was getting more refined with every passing hour. They surrounded Park with gentle, almost tender movements, reaching for him with hands that looked human but moved wrong. He stopped screaming almost immediately, started smiling instead, even as his eyes began to change color. Rhea fired her sidearm, emptying the entire magazine into the nearest entity, the one that had been Chen, but it didn't matter. The rounds punched through, created holes that sealed themselves in seconds, didn't even slow it down. The entities just kept coming, calm and patient, and utterly unstoppable. "Back room," Rhea shouted to Mara and Nolan. "Now! Move!" They fled deeper into the shelter, into the small emergency room at the back that was barely large enough for 3 people to stand in. Rhea sealed the interior emergency door behind them, the last line of defense, the last barrier between them and transformation. Through the gap at the bottom of the door, she could see Park's transformation happening in real time, could watch as his skin went translucent, as his eyes went black, as that horrible smile spread across his face like he'd just discovered the best secret in the world. The entities didn't try to force the door. They didn't need to. They just waited on the other side, patient and confident, like they had all the time in the world. Because they did. The back room was tiny, maybe 3 meters square, no windows, 1 door, 1 small heater that might last 3 hours if they were lucky. Rhea and Mara and Nolan wedged everything they could find against the door supply crates, the emergency medical kit, their own packs, anything that might slow down whatever was out there if it decided to come in. Outside, they heard the entities moving around in the main room, not trying to break through, not attacking, just waiting with that infinite patience that came from knowing the outcome was inevitable. "How long until pickup?" Mara whispered, her voice barely audible. Rhea checked her watch one more time, the numbers seeming to mock her. 3 hours and 12 minutes. "Can we hold out that long?" Rhea looked at the door, at the shadows moving on the other side, at the gap underneath where she could see Park's feet standing perfectly still. We don't have a choice. They sat with their backs against the door, weapons drawn even though they knew weapons were useless. Minutes crawled by like hours. The heater hummed quietly, fighting to keep the temperature above freezing. Outside, the Antarctic wind howled like something dying. At one point, Elias's voice called through the door, calm and reasonable, like a professor giving a lecture. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Commander. We're not going away. We can wait out here forever if we need to. And even if you survive long enough for the helicopter to arrive, do you really think you're not infected? You've been breathing the same air as everyone else for weeks. You've been drinking the same water, eating the same food. The crystalline structures are already inside you, growing, spreading, improving you cell by cell. It's just a matter of time before the transformation becomes visible, before you understand what you're becoming, before you welcome it." Rhea didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction, but she looked at her hands in the dim light of the emergency glow sticks they'd activated. Her nails were definitely darker than they should be, not black yet, but darker, grayer. And when she pressed her fingers against the cold metal wall, she could swear she felt the cold less than she had an hour ago, like something inside her was adapting, improving, preparing her for transformation. 3 hours, she told herself. Just hold out for 3 more hours. But part of her wondered if it was already too late. The helicopter arrived exactly on schedule at 0900. Rhea heard it before she saw it. The most beautiful sound she'd ever heard in her life, the heavy thump of military rotors cutting through the Antarctic wind, the sound of salvation coming out of the sky. The entities had disappeared sometime in the last hour, melting away into the darkness like they'd never been there, leaving the shelter empty except for the 3 of them and their growing terror that they were already infected, already changing, already lost. Rhea and Mara and Nolan pushed aside the barricade and stumbled out into the killing cold one more time, running for their lives across 50 meters of open ice toward the helicopter that was touching down in a storm of blown snow. A figure in thermal gear jumped out of the helicopter before it had fully landed. "Commander Volkov?" "That's me. Let's get you out of here. Go, go, go." They ran, climbed aboard, the door sealed behind them. The helicopter lifted, banking hard away from that cursed place, the shelter shrinking below them until it was just a small, dark shape on an endless white plain. Mara grabbed Rhea's hand, squeezing it hard enough to hurt. "We made it. We actually made it." "Yeah." But Rhea wasn't sure they had made it, not really. The pilot looked back at them from the cockpit. "Anyone else need evac?" "No," Rhea said, her voice flat and dead. "Everyone else is gone. We're all that's left." "Understood. ETA to McMurdo is 90 minutes. Medical teams are standing by with full quarantine protocols. You're going to be okay. 90 minutes to McMurdo Station. Then debriefing, blood tests, neural scans, quarantine. They'd want to know everything what happened at Glacier Station, what killed the crew, what the entities were. And she'd tell them, she'd give them Nolan's data, she'd warn them about the sample, about the cave, about the thing that had been sleeping under the ice for millions of years. She'd tell them everything. She just hoped someone would listen. But deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, Rhea knew the truth that was growing inside her along with those crystalline structures she could feel spreading through her tissue. It was already too late, because when she looked at her reflection in the helicopter window, just for a second, one brief, horrible second, her eyes looked darker than they should. And when she spoke, her voice had that faint, layered quality, that harmonic resonance that meant something else was learning to use her vocal cords. They'd made it out of Glacier Station alive. But had they really escaped? Or were they just carriers now, vectors for an infection that had been patient enough to wait millions of years under the ice, that could certainly wait a few more days to spread, taking the thing beneath the ice to the next population center, exactly as it had planned from the moment they drilled down and set it free. McMurdo Station, 4 days later. Rhea sat in medical quarantine, white walls, constant surveillance, blood tests every 6 hours, skin biopsies every 12, neural scans that made her head ache. The doctors said she was clean, no signs of infection, no cellular anomalies, no crystalline structures in her tissues, no unusual protein markers in her blood. Every test came back normal. Mara tested clean too. Nolan tested clean. They were the only survivors from Glacier Station, and after 96 hours of intensive medical screening, they'd been cleared for general population. Clean, healthy, human. Survivors. Rhea didn't feel like a survivor. She felt watched, studied, changed. On the 5th day, they released her from quarantine. Standard protocol, she'd passed every test, shown no signs of compromise, met every medical criterion for being certifiably human. She walked through McMurdo Station, nodding at familiar faces, grabbing coffee in the mess hall, trying to pretend everything was normal, that she was still herself, that nothing fundamental had changed. But nothing felt normal. In the mess hall, she sat alone with her tray of food that tasted like cardboard, her coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention. Someone sat down across from her. Mara. "Hey," Rhea said, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "Hey." They ate in silence for a while, neither of them really tasting the food, both of them going through the motions of being human, of being normal, of being alive. Then Mara looked up, and there was something in her eyes, a darkness, a knowledge, a shared secret that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "Do you ever feel like something's wrong?" Mara asked quietly. "Like we're not quite ourselves anymore? Like something's watching through our eyes, listening through our ears, learning how to be us?" Rhea's hand tightened on her cup hard enough that the plastic creaked. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's like I'm forgetting things, doing things I don't remember doing, waking up in places I don't remember going to. And my voice sounds different sometimes, like there's someone else speaking with my mouth." "Paranoia," Rhea said, the lie automatic. "Normal after what we went through. Trauma response," the doctor said. "The doctors are wrong," Mara interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been checking the security feeds. I've seen myself walking through the station at 3 in the morning, going places I don't remember, talking to people I don't remember meeting, and you're in them too, Rhea. You and Nolan, all 3 of us, moving around the station at night, doing things, meeting with people, having conversations we don't remember." Rhea felt something cold settle in her chest, and it had nothing to do with external temperature. Because she'd been checking the feeds too, had seen the same things, had been trying to convince herself it was a glitch, a mistake, anything but the truth. They finished eating in silence and stood to leave. Mara turned toward the exit. Rhea watched her go, and for just a second, one brief, horrible second, she saw Mara's reflection in the window. Black eyes, crystalline, empty. Then it was gone. Rhea blinked, looked again. Normal eyes, normal face, normal Mara. But she knew what she'd seen. Mara turned back, smiled at her. "You coming?" "Yeah," Rhea said quietly, forcing her voice to sound normal even though it felt layered, wrong, like someone else was learning to speak with her mouth. "Right behind you." But she wasn't behind Mara. She was checking her own hands under the table, looking at her nails in the harsh fluorescent light. They were darker than they'd been yesterday, gray rather than pink, almost black at the cuticles. And when she looked at her reflection in her empty coffee cup, she saw something else beneath her skin, Geometric patterns, crystalline structures, growing. She dropped the cup. It shattered on the floor. A technician rushed over, concerned. "Commander? You okay?" Rhea looked up at him, at his normal human face, his eyes that were still fully human, and she wondered how long he had before he started changing too. "I'm fine," she said. And when she said it, her voice sounded layered, like multiple people speaking at once, like something that had learned human speech but hadn't quite perfected the single voice illusion yet. The technician didn't notice. Nobody ever did. Because the entities weren't invading anymore, weren't attacking, weren't forcing their way in. They were integrating, quietly, perfectly, invisibly, replacing people one cell at a time, one day at a time, so slowly that nobody noticed the change until it was complete. By the time anyone realized what was happening, half of McMurdo walked with darkness growing beneath their skin and voices that echoed just slightly wrong if you listened carefully enough, if you knew what to listen for. But nobody listened carefully. Everyone was too busy with their work, with their routines, with their normal lives. Nobody noticed the small changes. The way some people's eyes caught the light wrong. The way some voices had that faint harmonic quality. The way some people moved just slightly too precisely, like they were learning to make human movement look natural. Nobody noticed. Until it was everywhere. 3 weeks later, a supply ship left McMurdo for Ushuaia, Argentina. 40 passengers boarded, a mix of scientists finished with their rotations, support staff heading home, crew rotating off station after the winter season. Families waiting for them, jobs waiting, normal lives waiting. Some of the passengers were still human. Most weren't. But they all smiled at the right times, waved goodbye with appropriate enthusiasm, showed all the correct emotions, said all the right things. Perfect. Too perfect. The ship departed on schedule. No alarms were raised. No quarantine protocols triggered. Every passenger had passed their mandatory medical screenings, blood work perfectly normal, neural scan showing no abnormalities, tissue samples revealing no foreign structures. Clean. The ship sailed north across the Drake Passage, through some of the roughest water on Earth, through seas that could swallow ships whole. None of the passengers got seasick. Not a single one. And when the ship docked in Ushuaia 6 days later, the passengers disembarked like normal people coming home from a long deployment in the ice. They cleared customs with perfect documents, boarded planes heading north and west and east, spread through Argentina, through Chile, through Brazil. Some flew to North America, some to Europe, some to Asia, some to Australia. Business class, economy, first class, cargo holds full of scientific equipment that passed every inspection. It didn't matter how they traveled. They were patient. They were everywhere. And they were learning. Learning cities, learning languages, learning cultures, learning how to be human better than humans themselves. Within a month, they were in 40 countries. Within 3 months, they were on every continent. And nobody noticed. Because they were perfect, because they passed every test, because they knew how to hide in plain sight, how to be invisible, how to wait. The thing beneath the ice had learned patience over millions of years buried under kilometers of frozen water. It had learned adaptation, watching the world change above it, waiting for the right moment. It had learned integration, understanding that the best way to conquer wasn't through force but through perfect mimicry. And now it was teaching humanity what it meant to evolve. Not through violence, not through conquest, not through war. Through perfect, invisible replacement, through slow, inexorable transformation that nobody saw coming until it was far, far too late to stop. Because the thing beneath the ice wasn't a monster. It was a teacher, and humanity was proving to be an excellent student The ice didn't just remember. It learned, and what it learned, it shared with everyone, whether they wanted it or not. Folklore note: Antarctica has been called the last wilderness, the final frontier, a continent untouched by human civilization for millions of years. A frozen wasteland where nothing lives and nothing changes, preserved in ice like a museum exhibit of planetary history. But that's never been entirely true. Long before Western explorers ever reached the Antarctic coast, indigenous peoples from the southern tip of South America, the Yaghan and the Ona, had stories about the ice to the south. Ancient stories passed down through countless generations, stories about lights that moved beneath the glaciers with purpose and intelligence. Stories about things that slept in the cold places where the world itself seemed to hold its breath and wait. Stories that came with warnings as old as the stories themselves. Don't wake what's sleeping beneath the ice. Don't drill too deep into the frozen places. Don't bring the old things up into the warm world. Some doors should stay closed. Some ice should never melt. Western explorers, as Western explorers tend to do throughout history, ignored those warnings completely. Shackleton, Amundsen, Scott, all the great Antarctic explorers wrote about strange phenomena they encountered on the ice, things that didn't make it into the official histories but filled the margins of their private journals, lights in the ice that had no source they could identify, sounds that didn't match any known animal on Earth, the persistent, overwhelming feeling of being watched in places where nothing could possibly live, where there was nothing but ice and wind and darkness for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Most people dismiss these accounts as isolation-induced madness, as the mind playing tricks when subjected to months of darkness and cold and sensory deprivation, hallucinations, psychological breaks. Nothing to worry about. But some people took the accounts seriously. Some people wondered what might be buried down there under all that ice. Operation High Jump in 1947 saw 13 ships and over 4,000 military personnel deployed to Antarctica, officially to map the continent and establish research stations, to claim territory and plant flags in the name of national interest. Unofficially, according to documents that were declassified decades later with most of the interesting parts redacted, they were looking for something specific, something the government wouldn't discuss publicly. Something important enough to deploy thousands of personnel to the most hostile environment on Earth. The mission ended early after several weeks. Casualties were reported but never detailed. Equipment losses were significant. No official explanation was ever given for why they packed up and left so abruptly. The site they were excavating was sealed and declared off-limits. It remains off-limits to this day. In the 1980s, Russian drilling operations at Lake Vostok, a massive subglacial lake buried under 4 kilometers of ice, isolated from the surface world for millions of years, were mysteriously halted just before a breakthrough to the lake itself. Scientists reported equipment malfunctions and unexplained psychological distress among the team members. Several researchers requested immediate transfer off the project, citing reasons they wouldn't elaborate on in official reports. The drilling site was sealed. The project was officially suspended due to environmental concerns. They never broke through to the lake. Nobody ever explained why. In 2003, British researchers at Glacier Station reported unusual seismic activity in the ice beneath their station, movement patterns that didn't match any known geological process. Thermal anomalies, sources of heat where everything should have been frozen solid for millions of years. The findings were classified by mutual agreement between multiple governments. The data was never published. The research team was quietly reassigned. In 2012, a Norwegian team drilling in the Gamburtsev mountain range, a mountain range bigger than the Alps buried under kilometers of ice, completely invisible from the surface, lost contact with their support station for 72 hours. When they were finally located, they couldn't or wouldn't explain where they'd been or what they'd seen. Medical scans showed no physical abnormalities. Psychologically, they tested within normal parameters. But their families, the people who knew them best, reported that the team members who came back seemed different somehow, changed in ways that were hard to articulate. Little things, the way they moved, the way they spoke, the expressions they made, small changes that added up to a feeling that these weren't quite the same people who had left. The truth is simple and terrifying. We don't know what's buried under the Antarctic ice. We don't know how long it's been there. We don't know what happens when the ice melts, when we drill through to places that have been sealed away from sunlight and air for millions or billions of years. What we do know, what every culture with knowledge of the frozen places has tried to tell us, is that some things were buried for a reason. Some doors should stay closed. Some ice should never melt. The researchers at Glacier Station learned that lesson too late. By the time they understood what they'd awakened, by the time they realized what was spreading through their station and then through their bodies and then through the world, it was already too late to stop it. Too late to seal it back up. Too late to undo what they'd done. Because the thing beneath the ice wasn't hostile. It didn't want to destroy humanity. It was adaptive. It was intelligent. It was patient beyond human comprehension. It didn't want to kill us. It wanted to join us, to integrate with us, to improve us, to become us. And in the end, that was so much worse than any monster we could have imagined. Because monsters you can fight. But how do you fight something that wears your face, that speaks with your voice, that knows everything you know? That is you, but better, but improved, but not quite human anymore? You can't. You can only watch as it spreads, as it learns, as it becomes invisible, and hope that somewhere, somehow, someone notices before it's too late. Before we forget what it means to be human. Before we welcome what comes next. End of story. Well, boys and ghouls, that wraps up another terrorific tale from the vault. Oh, poor Rhea. How tragic. How unfortunate. Thought she escaped the ice. Thought she saved her people. But some things don't need to chase you when they've already gotten inside you. When you're the vector, when you're teaching the world a lesson it never wanted to learn. The helicopter flew north. The ship sailed home, and humanity's newest evolution, already walking among us, teaching us what it means to be better, just how we love it. If this story froze you to your core, hit that subscribe button. New creature features drop every day at 8 p.m. Central, and trust me, tomorrow's nightmare is even colder. Leave a like if you'll never trust a research station again, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What would you do if you realized you weren't quite yourself anymore? I'm always hunting for the next frozen nightmare. Remember, not everything buried in ice is dead. Some things are just waiting for us to drill deep enough. Until next time, kiddies, keep your fires burning and your eyes on the thermometer. This has been your late night creature feature. I'm Mr. Wendigo, and the ice is always learning.